In the rolling hills of northeast Atlanta, hidden behind overgrown magnolias and rusting iron gates, stand a monument to America's most recognizable brand. The 42-room Italian Renaissance mansion, known as Briarcliffe, was built by the man who turned a backroom pharmaceutical concoction into a global empire. But the story of Asa Candler's palace isn't the triumphant tale of American capitalism that Coca-Cola's marketing department would have you believe. It's a darker narrative of addiction, exploitation, family destruction, and madness that mirrors the very beverage that built it. This is the story of how one man's ruthless ambition created both a billion-dollar empire and a cursed estate where his family would eventually tear itself apart. The year was 1888, and Asa Griggs Candler was a 36-year-old pharmacist struggling to make ends meet in Atlanta's competitive drugstore business. Born in 1851 in rural Georgia, to a merchant family that had lost everything in the Civil War, Candler had spent his entire adult life chasing financial security that always seemed just out of reach. His drugstore on Peachtree Street was barely profitable, and he was supporting a wife and 4 children on margins so thin that some months he couldn't pay his rent. Then he heard about a peculiar syrup being sold by a morphine-addicted pharmacist named John Pemberton. The brain tonic contained extracts of coca leaves and cola nuts, mixed with sugar and caramel coloring. Pemberton called it Coca-Cola, and he was selling it for 5 cents a glass at Jacob's Pharmacy downtown. The drink was popular enough, but Pemberton was dying, broke, and desperate. He had already sold portions of his formula to various investors, creating a tangled mess of competing claims and partnerships. What happened next is where Coca-Cola's official history gets deliberately vague. According to the company's sanitized version, Candler simply purchased the formula and rights to Coca-Cola for $2,300 in 1888. But the reality was far more predatory. Candler didn't just buy Pemberton's formula. He systematically hunted down every person who owned a piece of it, using a combination of legal intimidation, financial pressure, and what some historians have called outright fraud. Pemberton's widow, Martha, later claimed that Candler had taken advantage of her husband's morphine addiction to purchase his shares for a fraction of their value. Another partner, Woolfolk Walker, alleged that Candler had promised him a permanent stake in the company, then used legal technicalities to squeeze him out entirely. By 1891, Candler had complete control of Coca-Cola, and he had done it for less than $5,000 total, a steal even by 19th century standards. But Candler wasn't just ruthless in business. He understood something fundamental about human psychology that would make him one of the richest men in America: addiction cells. And the original Coca-Cola formula wasn't just refreshing, it was genuinely addictive. The early formula of Coca-Cola contained approximately 9 milligrams of cocaine per glass. Now, Candler and the company would later claim this amount was negligible, barely noticeable. But here's what they never mentioned in their advertising. 9 milligrams might not sound like much, but when you're drinking 3 or 4 glasses a day, which many customers did, you're consuming enough cocaine to develop a genuine dependency. Coca-Cola wasn't just a beverage. It was a delivery system for a drug that the American government hadn't yet gotten around to regulating. Candler knew exactly what he was doing. His background as a pharmacist meant he understood the properties of coca leaves far better than the average businessman. Internal company documents from the 1890s show that Candler was meticulous about the cocaine content, not to reduce it, but to standardize it. He wanted every glass of Coca-Cola to deliver the same subtle euphoric effect that kept customers coming back day after day. The advertising from this era tells the whole story. Coca-Cola was marketed as a cure for morphine addiction, alcoholism, headaches, neurasthenia, and depression. Relieves mental and physical exhaustion, the ads proclaimed. The wonderful nerve and brain tonic. They weren't technically lying. Cocaine does relieve exhaustion and stimulate the brain. But they were creating a generation of Americans who were unknowingly dependent on a drug they thought was just a pleasant soft drink. By 1895, Coca-Cola was being sold in every state in the Union. Candler had built an empire on a simple principle: get them hooked, then keep them coming back. The profits were staggering. What cost pennies to produce sold for nickels, and Americans were consuming it by the millions of gallons. Asa Candler was becoming obscenely wealthy, and he was doing it by putting cocaine into the hands of children and adults alike, all under the respectable guise of a pharmaceutical tonic. But even as his fortune grew, Candler maintained an image of rigid morality. He was a devout Methodist, a Sunday school teacher, a man who publicly condemned alcohol, tobacco, and moral degeneracy. The contradiction was stunning. A man who built his wealth on addiction while preaching temperance. Yet this was entirely consistent with the peculiar morality of the Gilded Age, where robber barons could exploit workers, corner markets, and destroy competitors, all while attending church on Sunday and considering themselves pillars of Christian virtue. By 1906, Candler's personal fortune had grown to well over $20 million, equivalent to more than $500 million today. He owned the world's most valuable beverage brand, a massive real estate portfolio in downtown Atlanta, and controlling interests in several banks. He was also deeply paranoid. The progressive era had arrived, and with it came journalists who called themselves muckrakers. These reporters had an annoying habit of investigating powerful men and exposing uncomfortable truths. Ida Tarbell had destroyed John D. Rockefeller's reputation with her exposé of Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair had nearly shut down the meatpacking industry with The Jungle. And now these crusading journalists were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about what exactly was in Coca-Cola. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, requiring companies to list their ingredients. Suddenly, Candler had a problem. If he admitted the cocaine content on the label, the government would regulate it. If he removed the cocaine entirely, loyal customers might notice the drink didn't have quite the same kick. His solution was characteristic of his approach to business. He lied. Candler removed most of the cocaine from the formula, but kept just enough to maintain what internal memos called the characteristic effect. Then he claimed the product was completely cocaine-free. When the federal government challenged him on this in 1909, seizing 40 barrels of Coca-Cola syrup and charging the company with misbranding, Candler fought back with an army of lawyers. The case dragged on for years, with Candler spending a fortune in legal fees rather than simply admitting what was in his product. The truth finally came out in 1911 when government chemists testified that Coca-Cola still contained trace amounts of cocaine, along with enough caffeine to be genuinely harmful. One expert testified that a single glass of Coca-Cola contained as much caffeine as 2 cups of coffee, and Americans were giving it to children. The judge ruled against Coca-Cola, but by then Candler had finally removed all the cocaine from the formula. The damage to his reputation among the educated classes was done, but the general public never really cared. Coca-Cola was too popular, too deeply embedded in American culture. The addiction had already taken hold. It was in this climate of growing wealth and simmering scandal that Asa Candler decided to build a mansion that would cement his place among America's aristocracy. He had the money. He had the power. Now he wanted the palace to prove it. In 1910, Candler purchased 225 acres of pristine woodland in what was then the far outskirts of Atlanta, in an area called Druid Hills. The land sat on the highest point in the county, with commanding views of the city below. This wasn't just any property. It was part of Frederick Law Olmsted's grand vision for Atlanta, a planned community of curving roads and natural beauty that was supposed to rival New York Central Park. Candler was buying into more than real estate. He was buying into the idea of Southern aristocracy reborn. He hired the architectural firm of G.L. Norman to design a mansion that would dwarf anything else in the South. The plans called for a 42-room Italian Renaissance palazzo, built from Indiana limestone and Georgia marble, with Ionic columns, ornate balustrades, and a tile roof imported from Spain. The main house would span nearly 20,000 square feet, with another 10,000 square feet of servants' quarters, stables, and outbuildings. Every detail was to be exquisite, from the hand-carved mahogany paneling in the library to the Tiffany stained glass windows in the conservatory. But Candler didn't just want a big house. He wanted a statement. The central feature of the estate was a massive porte-cochere, a covered entrance large enough to accommodate multiple carriages at once. Above it, the family crest was carved into the limestone, a fabricated coat of arms that implied centuries of noble lineage that the Candler family absolutely did not possess. It was the architectural equivalent of lying on a job application, and it was perfect for a man who had built his fortune on deception. The estate was named Briarcliff, supposedly after the wild roses that grew on the property, Those cynics noted it sounded suspiciously like the names of established English estates. Construction began in 1910 and took nearly 4 years to complete. The cost was staggering, over $1 million, equivalent to roughly $30 million today. For context, that was enough money to build and equip a mid-sized hospital. But Candler wasn't interested in philanthropy at the moment. He was interested in making sure every Atlanta businessman who drove past his estate understood exactly who was in charge. The grounds were landscaped by the Olmsted firm themselves, with formal gardens, reflecting pools, and miles of riding trails through the surrounding forest. There was a private golf course, tennis courts, and a massive conservatory filled with exotic plants from around the world. The stables housed 20 thoroughbred horses. The garage contained a collection of luxury automobiles, including a custom Rolls-Royce with the Coca-Cola logo embossed on the doors in gold leaf. Subtlety was not Asa Candler's strong suit. Inside, the mansion was a monument to excess. The grand entrance hall featured a sweeping double staircase with hand-forged iron railings. The ballroom could accommodate 200 guests beneath crystal chandeliers imported from Austria. The dining room table seated 36. Candler's personal study was paneled in rare woods from South America, with built-in bookcases that held first editions he never read. His wife Lucy's bedroom suite included a bathroom with a sunken marble bathtub large enough to swim in. But perhaps the most revealing room in the entire mansion was Candler's private office on the second floor. This was where he conducted business, and it was designed to intimidate. The room was deliberately oversized, with a cathedral ceiling and Candler's desk positioned on a raised platform at the far end. Anyone meeting with him had to cross 30 feet of polished marble floor while he watched from his elevated position. Behind his desk hung a portrait of himself, commissioned at enormous expense, showing him in formal attire with his hand resting on a globe, a not-so-subtle message that his empire was global. On his desk sat a bottle of Coca-Cola, the source of everything. The Candler family moved into Briarcliffe in 1914, and almost immediately, cracks began to show in the facade. Asa's wife Lucy had never wanted this palace. She was a simple woman, deeply religious, uncomfortable with ostentation. The move from their comfortable but modest home on Seaboard Avenue to this sprawling mansion filled her with dread. She told friends she felt like a prisoner in a museum, surrounded by servants she didn't need and luxury she found vulgar. The 5 Candler children, Howard, Asa Jr., Lucy, Walter, and William, had their own complicated reactions to their new home. Howard, the eldest, was already working for Coca-Cola and resented living in his father's shadow. Asa Jr. had developed a serious alcohol problem, ironic considering his father's temperance preaching. Lucy, the only daughter, was engaged to a man her father despised and would eventually elope rather than have a wedding at Briarcliffe. Walter showed signs of the mental instability that would eventually destroy him. And William, the youngest, seemed determined to spend his father's money as fast as humanly possible. But Asa Candler was too focused on his empire to notice his family falling apart. By 1915, Coca-Cola was selling over 100 million gallons a year. He had become a national figure, consulted by politicians, courted by investors, featured in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. In 1916, he was elected mayor of Atlanta, a position he used primarily to enhance his business interests and crack down on labor unions. His administration was marked by bitter strikes, violent suppression of workers, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge that anyone working for low wages in his bottling plants or delivery routes might have legitimate grievances. During his tenure as mayor, Atlanta saw some of its worst labor violence. When workers at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill went on strike in 1914, demanding a living wage and an end to child labor, Candler sided firmly with management. He used city police to break up picket lines and had strike leaders arrested on trumped-up charges. When a young mill worker named Mary Fagan was murdered in 1913, the case became a national sensation, partly because it exposed the brutal working conditions in Atlanta's factories, conditions that men like Candler had created and profited from. The trial and lynching of Leo Frank that followed ripped the city apart and revealed the violent undercurrents beneath Atlanta's progressive facade. Through it all, Candler maintained his image as a pillar of the community. He donated generously to Emory University, though careful observers noted that these donations came with strings attached, buildings named after him, influence over university policies, and a guaranteed admission path for his children regardless of their qualifications. He funded the construction of churches, but only Methodist ones that preached the gospel of wealth and hard work. His philanthropy was strategic, designed to buy influence and burnish his reputation, not to meaningfully address the poverty and inequality his business practices had helped create. At Briercliffe, life had settled into a strange routine. Asa would rise at 5 a.m., take a cold bath, eat a Spartan breakfast, and be driven to his downtown office by 7. He would work until 8 in the evening, eating lunch at his desk, conducting meetings with an efficiency that bordered on brutality. He had a reputation for firing executives on the spot if they showed any sign of weakness or independent thinking. His philosophy was simple. Coca-Cola was his creation, and everyone who worked for the company worked for him personally. Dissent was betrayal. Lucy, meanwhile, rattled around the mansion with increasingly desperate unhappiness. She had 36 rooms and nothing to do. The servants handled everything. Her children were grown or growing, caught up in their own dramas. She tried to occupy herself with church work and charity, but there's only so much time you can spend organizing church bazaars when you're living in a palace built on cocaine profits. The marriage had been dead for years, though neither would admit it publicly. They maintained separate bedrooms, ate meals in silence when they ate together at all, and communicated primarily through servants and written notes. Asa saw his wife as a relic of his poor past, a reminder of the struggling pharmacist he used to be. Lucy saw her husband as a stranger who had been replaced by a money-obsessed automaton somewhere along the way. The first real scandal to touch Briarcliff came in 1916, when Asa Jr. was arrested for public drunkenness outside an Atlanta speakeasy. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating. Asa Candler had built much of his public image on temperance and moral rectitude. He had given speeches condemning alcohol as the devil's tool. And now his own son, his namesake, was being photographed in handcuffs, clearly intoxicated. Candler Sr. responded with characteristic ruthlessness. He paid off the police, killed the story in the Atlanta papers he had influence over, and had his son committed to a private sanitarium for nervous exhaustion. Asa Jr. spent 3 months in what was essentially a luxury prison, being treated for alcoholism by doctors who were financially dependent on his father. When he was released, he was given a meaningless position at Coca-Cola with strict orders to stay out of sight and keep his mouth shut. But the damage went deeper than public embarrassment. Asa Jr.'s alcoholism was a symptom of something Candler Sr. refused to acknowledge: the immense pressure of being Candler. His children had grown up in the shadow of a man who valued money and power above all else, who showed affection through financial gifts rather than emotional presence, who saw his own children as extensions of his brand rather than as human beings. Asa Jr. drank because it was the only way he knew to escape his father's expectations. And he wasn't the only one suffering. Walter Candler, the third son, was beginning to show signs of serious mental illness. He had violent mood swings, periods of grandiose thinking followed by deep depressions, and an increasing detachment from reality. In any other family, this would have been addressed with compassion and proper medical care. But in the Candler family, mental illness was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Walter was told to pull himself together and stop embarrassing the family. Howard, the eldest and the heir apparent to the Coca-Cola empire, had his own quiet crisis. He was competent at business, but had none of his father's ruthless drive. He wanted to please his father but found the cost of doing so, becoming the same kind of man, increasingly unbearable. He began having anxiety attacks, severe enough that he had to excuse himself from board meetings. His father's response was to tell him to work harder, as if sheer effort could cure a nervous system in revolt. Lucy, the only daughter, found her own way to rebel. In 1917, she eloped with a man named Daniel Morgan, a middle-class attorney whom Asa Candler considered far beneath the family station. Candler was furious. He threatened to disown her, cut her off financially, and remove her from his will. Lucy's response was to send her father a telegram that simply read, "Married. Happy. Goodbye." She didn't speak to him for the next 3 years. William, the youngest, took the opposite approach. He enthusiastically embraced the lifestyle his father's money could buy, spending huge sums on cars, clothes, parties, and women. He had no interest in Coca-Cola or any kind of real work. He saw himself as European aristocracy, a gentleman of leisure whose sole job was to enjoy himself. Asa was disgusted by William's behavior, but also secretly envious. William had the freedom to enjoy wealth that Asa, with his rigid self-discipline and endless work, had never allowed himself. By 1918, Briercliffe had become less a home than a monument to dysfunction. The massive house sat on its hill, beautifully maintained, its 42 rooms echoing with silence and suppressed rage. Servants moved through the halls like ghosts, trained not to see or hear family arguments. The formal gardens were perfect, the stables immaculate, the conservatory filled with blooms. But inside, the family that had built this palace was slowly destroying itself. Then, in 1919, everything changed. Asa Candler sold the Coca-Cola Company. The decision stunned Atlanta's business community. Candler was Coca-Cola. The company was his identity, his life's work, the source of his power. Why would he possibly sell? The official explanation was that he wanted to focus on his real estate investments and philanthropic work. The truth was more complicated and more disturbing. Candler was 67 years old and showing signs of what we would now recognize as dementia. His memory was failing. He had difficulty concentrating. In meetings, he would sometimes forget what was being discussed mid-sentence. He repeated himself constantly. The sharp, ruthless businessman who had built a billion-dollar empire was fading, and he knew it. Rather than lose control slowly and publicly, he decided to sell while he could still command top dollar. The Coca-Cola Company was sold to a group of investors led by Ernest Woodruff for $25 million, roughly $700 million in today's money. Candler walked away with the largest personal fortune in the South and absolutely no idea what to do with himself. Retirement was a disaster. For 50 years, Candler's entire identity had been built on work, on building, on conquering. Now, with nothing to do, he began to mentally unravel. He would wake up at 5 a.m. out of habit, get dressed for the office, then remember he had no office to go to. He wandered the halls of Briercliffe, confused and agitated. Some days, he would insist on being driven to the Coca-Cola headquarters downtown, then seem surprised when security wouldn't let him in without an appointment. The company he had built had moved on without him. His relationship with Lucy, already strained to the breaking point, finally collapsed. In 1920, she filed for divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty. The filing sent shockwaves through Atlanta society. Men of Candler's generation and class simply didn't get divorced. It was scandalous, shameful, a public admission that something was desperately wrong. Lucy's petition detailed years of emotional abuse, neglect, and what she called his obsessive pursuit of wealth to the exclusion of all human feeling. The newspapers had a field day. The man who had sold temperance and family values was being portrayed as a cruel husband who had driven his wife away through sheer callousness. Candler's response was to fight the divorce with every resource he had. He hired the best lawyers in Georgia and launched a vicious counterattack, claiming Lucy was mentally unstable and seeking to steal his fortune. The divorce proceedings turned into a public spectacle that revealed just how miserable their marriage had been. Servants testified about separate bedrooms and years of silent meals. Friends describe a relationship that had been dead in everything but name for decades. The facade of the perfect family crumbled completely. In the end, Lucy got her divorce, a substantial settlement, and her freedom. She immediately left Briarcliff in Atlanta, moving to California, where she lived quietly for the rest of her life. She never returned to Georgia, never spoke publicly about her marriage, and made it clear to her children that the subject was closed. Asa Candler was now alone in his 42-room mansion, a confused old man surrounded by servants and silence. His children visited rarely and reluctantly. His fortune was intact, but meaningless. The company he had built was thriving under new management that had no use for him. He was, in every sense that mattered, finished. In 1921, in what can only be described as a desperate attempt to recapture something, Candler married again. His new wife was May Little Reagan, a woman 40 years his junior. She was 29. He was 69. The wedding took place at Briarcliffe with only a handful of guests, most of whom attended out of obligation rather than celebration. The marriage was a catastrophe from the start. May had married Candler for his money, and she made no secret of it. She immediately began redecorating Briarcliffe, throwing out Lucy's furnishings and replacing them with modern pieces that Candler hated. She hosted parties for her young friends, filling the mansion with jazz music and flapper dresses and bootleg liquor, everything Candler despised. She treated him with barely concealed contempt, calling him the old man to his face. But May had miscalculated. Candler might have been old and confused, but he wasn't quite senile enough to tolerate being openly mocked in his own home. After just a year of marriage, he filed for divorce, citing her adultery with multiple partners. The divorce was even messier than his split with Lucy, with accusations flying both directions. May claimed Candler had promised her millions and was now trying to cheat her. Candler claimed she had married him under false pretenses and was nothing more than a gold digger. Both were probably right. The divorce was finalized in 1924, with May receiving a settlement of just $50,000, a fraction of what she had expected. She left Atlanta in disgrace and was never heard from again. Candler retreated back into Briarcliffe, now twice divorced, a figure of ridicule, his reputation in tatters. His children, witnessing their father's disintegration, began fighting over his fortune even before he was dead. Lawsuits flew between siblings, each accusing the others of trying to manipulate the old man into changing his will. Howard claimed Asa Jr. was stealing from the estate. William claimed Howard was embezzling from the family trusts. Walter, whose mental illness had progressed to the point of full psychotic breaks, claimed everyone was conspiring against him. The Candler children were destroying each other exactly as their father had taught them, with lawyers and money and absolutely no mercy. Candler himself barely noticed. His dementia had progressed to the point where he lived mostly in the past, sometimes thinking he was still a struggling pharmacist, sometimes believing he was still running Coca-Cola. He would wander the halls of Briarcliffe, calling for Lucy, forgetting they were divorced. Servants found him in his nightclothes, standing in the ballroom at 3 a.m, talking to people who weren't there. On March 12, 1929, Asa Griggs Candler died in his bedroom at Briarcliffe. He was 77 years old. The cause of death was listed as a stroke, but in truth, he had been dying by inches for years. His funeral was a massive affair, with thousands of Atlantans lining the streets to watch his procession pass. Coca-Cola executives gave speeches about his vision and genius. Ministers praised his faith and generosity. The newspapers called him a giant of American industry. None of them mentioned the cocaine, the union busting, the broken family, or the 2 bitter divorces. History was already being sanitized. After Candler's death, Briarcliffe became a burden no one wanted. The estate was enormous, expensive to maintain, and carried the taint of the family's very public dysfunction. None of the children wanted to live there. The property was divided among them, then sold off piece by piece. The mansion itself was eventually purchased by the Georgia Mental Health Institute in 1957, which seemed grimly appropriate given the Candler family's history of untreated mental illness. The estate served as a psychiatric hospital for decades, housing patients in rooms that had once hosted Atlanta's elite. The ballroom became a rec room. The conservatory was turned into a therapy space. The grand entrance hall was partitioned with cheap drywall. The institution added cinder block wings that destroyed the architectural integrity. The gardens were paved over for parking lots. Everything that had made Briarcliffe grand was systematically destroyed by budget cuts, neglect, and institutional indifference. By the 1990s, the property had been abandoned entirely. The state of Georgia had closed the mental health facility, and Briarcliffe sat empty, slowly rotting. Vandals broke the windows. Copper piping was stripped and sold for scrap. Rain leaked through the Spanish tiles, destroying the ornate plasterwork inside. The grand staircase began to collapse. Squatters moved into the servants' quarters. The once pristine grounds turned into jungle. Today, what remains of Briarcliffe is a ruin. The main house still stands, barely, hidden behind chain-link fencing and no trespassing signs. Urban explorers and photographers occasionally sneak in to document the decay. Their photos show a mansion in its death throes, collapsed ceilings, rotted floors, walls covered in graffiti. The hand-carved mahogany paneling is warped and moldy. The crystal chandeliers are long gone, sold or stolen. The marble floors are cracked and littered with debris. Asa Candler's private office, where he once intimidated business rivals from his elevated desk, is now filled with bird droppings and broken glass. There have been multiple plans over the years to restore Briarcliff. Developers have proposed turning it into luxury condos, a boutique hotel, and events venue. The Coca-Cola company itself was approached about purchasing the property for a museum, but declined, apparently having no interest in highlighting this particular piece of their history. Every plan has fallen through due to the enormous cost of restoration and the property's complicated legal status. The truth is, nobody really wants to save Briarcliff. It's too big, too expensive, and too haunted, not by ghosts, but by the ugly history it represents. This is the monument to Asa Candler's life, and it's rotting into the Georgia clay. The legacy of Asa Candler and his mansion is more complicated than either his admirers or critics might admit. Candler was undeniably a brilliant businessman who built one of the most successful brands in human history. Coca-Cola is now consumed in over 200 countries, recognized by nearly every human being on Earth. The company employs hundreds of thousands of people. It has created enormous wealth. From a purely capitalist perspective, Candler was a wild success. But that success came at a cost that's impossible to ignore. Candler built his initial fortune by selling an addictive substance to an unsuspecting public. He lied about what was in his product. He fought regulations designed to protect consumers. He exploited workers, crushed unions, and used his wealth to buy political influence. He destroyed his family through neglect and emotional cruelty. He created a palace as a monument to his ego, and it became a tomb for his relationships. Briercliffe stands, or rather, slowly collapses, as a perfect metaphor for the Gilded Age itself. It's a monument to excess built on exploitation, a beautiful facade covering rot, a dream of aristocracy imposed on a country that supposedly rejected such things. The irony is that Candler achieved everything he wanted. He became rich. He became powerful. He built a mansion that impressed everyone who saw it, and it made him miserable. In the end, what remains? Coca-Cola thrives, but it's been reformed, regulated, made safe by the very government oversight Candler fought against. The cocaine is gone. The company is run by professional managers with business degrees, not driven entrepreneurs with drugstore backgrounds. The brand is so ubiquitous that it's become invisible, just part of the background noise of modern life. Nobody drinking a Coke today thinks about Asa Candler. Nobody cares who he was or what he did. His name appears nowhere on the can. His mansion, the physical monument to his wealth and power, is a wreck that will probably be demolished within the next decade. His children scattered to the winds, most dying estranged from each other. His two wives both left him. His legacy has been erased or sanitized. The Candler name, which he spent his entire life trying to elevate to the ranks of American aristocracy, is forgotten except by historians and people who research obscure Atlanta history. There's a lesson in Briarcliff, though whether anyone is listening is questionable. The lesson is simple. You cannot buy meaning. You cannot build happiness out of limestone and marble. You cannot create a legacy through brute force and ruthless ambition. Candler had everything money could buy and nothing money couldn't. He had a palace and no peace. He had wealth and no wisdom. He had power and no purpose beyond the accumulation of more power. And now he has nothing but a crumbling mansion and a paragraph in Coca-Cola's corporate history, carefully worded to avoid mentioning the cocaine, the divorces, the broken family, and the mental collapse. He has been turned into mythology, sanitized and safe, useful for branding purposes, but divorced from the complicated, often ugly reality of who he actually was. If you drive through Druid Hills today, you might pass by the old Briarcliffe property without even knowing it's there. The entrance is overgrown, the gates rusted shut. The mansion is barely visible from the road, hidden behind decades of unchecked growth. There's no historical marker, no plaque explaining what once stood here. Atlanta has moved on, grown around this ghost, and forgotten it. But if you know where to look, if you find a right gap in the fence and don't mind trespassing, you can still walk through Asa Candler's palace. You can stand in the entrance hall, where Atlanta's elite once gathered. You can climb the collapsing grand staircase. You can walk into the ballroom where debutantes danced, and see it now, stripped and silent, and filled with water damage. And if you go to the second floor, navigate carefully around the weak spots in the floor, you can find Candler's private office. The raised platform where his desk sat is still there, though the desk itself is long gone. The walls are covered in mold and graffiti, but you can still see faint traces of the rare wood paneling underneath. The space behind the desk, where his self-aggrandizing portrait once hung, now frames nothing but a hole in the wall exposing rotted timbers. Standing there, in that ruined room, you can almost feel what it must have been like to be Asa Candler. The power, the control, the absolute certainty that he had won, that he had built something permanent. And then you look around at the destruction, at nature reclaiming his monument, at the absolute silence where there once was bustling activity, and you understand that he lost. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly and completely. His empire outlived him, but it doesn't belong to him anymore. His fortune was divided and spent. His family name carries no weight. His mansion is falling down. There's something almost biblical about it. The mighty brought low, the proud humbled. The rich man who stored up treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy. Candler would have hated the symbolism. He was a Methodist, but he believed in the prosperity gospel, the idea that wealth was evidence of God's favor, that material success proved spiritual worth. Standing in the ruins of Briarcliffe proves the exact opposite. This is what happens when you build your life on money alone. This is what happens when you treat people like obstacles or resources instead of human beings. This is what happens when you confuse acquisition with achievement, when you mistake power for purpose. You build a palace, and it becomes a prison. You create an empire, and it leaves you behind. You die alone in a 42-room mansion, calling for a wife who left you years ago, while your children fight over your money, and your name becomes a cautionary tale. Asa Candler's story should be required reading for every entrepreneur who thinks they're going to change the world. Because he did change the world. Coca-Cola is everywhere. And in the end, it didn't matter. The world changed, and he disappeared. The brand survived, and the man was forgotten. The product endured, and the palace fell apart. Somewhere in Atlanta, at the Coca-Cola headquarters or in the corporate archives, there must be photographs of Briercliffe in its prime. Pictures of the mansion when it was new, when the limestone was white and the gardens were perfect, and the whole thing gleamed like a promise fulfilled. The company must have these images, must know this history, but they've chosen not to display them, not to celebrate them, not to incorporate them into the brand story. That tells you everything you need to know. Even Coca-Cola, a company built on nostalgia and Americana, wants nothing to do with Asa Candler's mansion. It's too honest. It reveals too much. It shows what the first Coca-Cola fortune really looked like when you stripped away the marketing and faced the truth. The truth is addiction and exploitation wrapped in a beautiful package. The truth is a family destroyed by the same ruthless ambition that built an empire. The truth is a mansion rotting in the Georgia heat, vandalizing itself through neglect, returning to the earth it was built on. The truth is that sometimes the American dream doesn't have a happy ending. Sometimes it has an ending like this, silent, forgotten, and alone. Briercliffe is the monument Asa Candler built to himself. And the fact that it's falling apart, that nobody wants to save it, that it will probably be torn down and turned into bland condos or a shopping center within the next few years, that's the real monument. That's the truth about what he built and what it meant and what remains. In the end, Asa Candler got everything he wanted and nothing he needed. He has a place in history, but it's not the one he imagined. He's not remembered as a visionary or a captain of industry. He's remembered, when he's remembered at all, as the man who put cocaine in Coca-Cola and built a palace that became a psychiatric hospital that became a ruin. And maybe that's exactly what he deserves.